I've just received the news that the great tabla master Zakir Hussain has died. I'm actually in my studio and there's no internet here, so I'm cut off from the outside world. But every now and then I may get a text message come through. And I've just had a text message come through saying that Zakir has died. And I'm quite shocked, actually. I'm very unprepared to do this video. But when I do these tribute videos with so many people now passing away, so many legends passing away, I like to try and capture my thoughts there and then. You know, I can't see any point in rushing home and looking on Wikipedia, then just trotting that out to you. Because what that doesn't capture is what this guy meant to me. And what Zakir Hussain meant to me is he is the embodiment of the tabla. He is the preeminent tabla master. If somebody said, what does a tabla sound like? I would automatically go to play Zakir Hussain to them. Now, why is that? And it's because Zakir Hussain's journey into music was so absolutely unique. And it's that I want to talk about on this video. I'm nowhere near any information at all, but I think Zakir Hussain was born around about 1950. If he was born in 1950, then he was probably around about 73, 74 when he died. Why is this important? It's because we could sort of place him in the lineage of music history. And with most musicians, you would go, well, if he's born around about 1950, he would have been 20 in 1970, which means he would have been part of the early fusion scene, the early progressive rock scene. It's exactly the right age to be working in the period of music we discuss here. But of course, Zakir's journey through music wasn't quite like that, was it? Because Zakir was an Indian classically trained musician, and their training is completely unlike us in the West. Their training is completely different. An Indian classical musician does not learn to read music. Their harmony and theory systems are very different to ours in that they are working from a raga, which is a scale, and they have certain timing, which is additive time. They work with time that's sort of plumped together out of small units rather than being divided up in the West. It's a completely different system of dealing with music. And of course, because they don't read, everything is taught by ear, but with a very complex system. Now, Zakir being a tabla player, he would have learnt the conical system, which is where certain strikes on the tabla, certain rhythms are embodied in the voice, and then that's communicated in that way. Now, in Indian classical music, you've got two types of Indian classical music, and most musicians either come from sort of the North Indian or the Southern Indian traditions. And I think Zakir was pretty fluent in both. But what's interesting with Zakir Hussain is that he is, or was, sorry, the son of possibly the greatest tabla player of the 20th century, Alaraka, Ustad Alaraka, who was very famous for playing with Ravi Shankar. Now, one of the things that's interesting about Ravi Shankar is Ravi Shankar brought Indian classical music to the West. In the 1950s and 60s, he was journeying to America and England and performing there. And he was doing all sorts of collaborations with all sorts of different musicians, classical musicians, jazz musicians. And Ravi Shankar, in that regard, was a very outward-looking musician that, although he respected the traditions of Indian classical music, which are very traditional, even though it's an improvised form, it doesn't allow for the sort of expression that we have in jazz improvisation. It shares modes and it shares certain rhythmical devices, but in Indian classical music, that musician is trying to reveal the beauty of God's universe. The idea of trying to express yourself as an individual is not such a big thing in Indian classical music. But what's interesting is with Ravi Shankar's journey to America, and he's part of that in the 60s, that sort of fusion that's going on between East and West. with certain gurus coming across, music crossing over. Here in the UK, we had Joe Harriott with the Indo-Jazz fusion stuff that he was doing with John Mayer. Not the blues guitarist John Mayer, an earlier version. And so I get the feeling that Zakir Hussain had quite a cosmopolitan upbringing. And so it would have been very interesting for him to reach out to the Western musicians that were there. Now, if you went to India now, with their Bollywood film industry and their pop music industry and the groundbreaking work that has been done by musicians like Zakir Hussain, who is probably at the top of this, a modern Indian classical musician is quite able to converse with Western musicians, and that middle ground has been negotiated. So who was it negotiated by? Well, at the top of the list, it is, of course, John McLaughlin. John McLaughlin became interested in Indian classical music actually through a guitarist called Big Jim Sullivan, who was a session guitarist in the 1960s and then went on to become the sort of MD and guitarist for Tom Jones throughout the 70s and 80s. And Big Jim Sullivan was interested in esoteric stuff and Indian classical music, and I believe it was Big Jim that introduced John McLaughlin to that. Although I think with John, actually, he had actually developed an interest in Indian classical music before he arrived in London. I do remember this, yes. And it can be argued that it was Big Jim and John McLaughlin that actually opened up a young Jimmy Page, who they were mentoring in the early 60s, to Indian classical music and Indian scales. John McLaughlin takes this very seriously. By the time he pretty much invents the language of jazz rock fusion as we know it with the Mahavishnu Orchestra, one of the things he's done is integrate certain approaches into a sort of Hendrix-style rock band from Indian classical music. By 1976, I think John McLaughlin is becoming tired of that sound, and he becomes enamored with a completely different band, which starts out as a sort of hobby. It's a jam band. And this is a band which consists of John McLaughlin on a specially created guitar that has drone strings, like a sitar, Zakir Hussain on tabla, and El Shankar on violin. And Vinny, I can't remember, I've never pronounced that guy's name, but the guy that played the gatam, the clay pot. I know you're all shouting that at me. Now, Shakti, as time has come on, it has become seen as an absolutely legendary group. Of course, at the time, the record company saw much diminished sales from this project, and I think they weren't too happy when they went from the Mahavishnu Orchestra to Shakti. But I think Shakti became a gateway for so many of us into what we thought was Indian classical music. But the point I want to get across here is I believe those three musicians that were working with John McLaughlin and John McLaughlin himself had to create the middle ground where people could create serious music. Of course, people like the Beatles were experimenting in this area. Don Ellis had, and as I said, Joe Harriott had, with all varying degrees of, not success. The Beatles songs are brilliant, but how deep have they gone into the tradition? John McLaughlin actually took Veena lessons, and it was through those lessons that he actually came into contact with Zakir Hussain. And I think around about 1973, he sat down and jammed with Zakir Hussain, just guitar and tabla, and I think it was a revelation to him. And then Shakti was born. Now, Shakti was relatively short-lived. It made 3 albums. It existed from around about 1975 to, I'd say, around about 1977. The 3 studio albums. The first album's a live album recorded at Southampton College. The second album, Handful of Beauty, is a studio album, and the third album, which is called, it's got Mind Ecology on, Face to Face. I've said Handful of Beauty, haven't I? Come on, Andy. This is terrible. It's not called Peace of Mind, is it? This is why I'm doing this, you see. I'm trying to pull, and I've done well so far. I would say it's John McLaughlin's greatest solo album. After the Mahavishnu albums, I would say this album, the third Shakti album and the second studio album, which is called, it's you know when you can't remember it, it'll come back to me in a minute. Those are essential albums. this, I wouldn't say this propelled Zakir Hussain to superstardom, but it put him fair and square within sort of the Western rock music tradition. And coming out of that, he starts to pick up pop music gigs, basically. And he's jamming with all sorts of people. He has a very a very artistically rich association with Bill Laswell, working in all sorts of different fusion areas. He also works with people like Peter Gabriel. He plays on the Public Image Limited album called Album. And by the 1980s, he's become a superstar to the point where I have seen films where Zakir Hussain is acting in, I think there's a Merchant Ivory film that I could be called, is it Far Pavilions? I'm not too sure. But I can remember in the 1980s thinking, oh my God, this guy has really crossed over. And now he's acting in films. He became part of the cultural scene in the 1980s. So when we watch him play, we can, our mouths can drop open at the virtuosity of someone like him. And the training that he went through, which started probably around about 2 years old and was continual. It's a completely different entrance into music making than us in the West, which it's a hobby, and you buy a guitar and you jam in the garage. He was trained to live, eat and breathe music from a young man. And so when you've been engrossed so deeply in a tradition like that, to reach out and be able to successfully negotiate what he did and El Shankar did, and Vinny Viku, which is what I'm going to call him, did with Shakti is absolutely incredible. And then to be able to go on and move into the pop music realm and actually with those tablas reach into Western culture so deeply. So a couple of years ago, Shakti reformed. I went and got the album. It had been recorded using modern recording techniques, digital techniques, i.e. nobody was in the same room at the same time. And I was a little bit disappointed by it. I didn't feel the fire and interplay that there is on the original Shakti albums, or even the Remember Shakti albums that he was involved with in the late 90s. But they did go out on tour, and it was an incredible thing to see. And the live things sounded incredible. And it was very emotional to see them all back together, except for El Shankar. Now, it's a big mystery why El Shankar wasn't involved in the reforming of Shakti. And I think the reason for that is an interesting one. The official report was that they couldn't find him. I find that really difficult to believe. I think that these Indian classical musicians contact with Western popular music and many of the approaches and maybe dangers, vices, affects musicians in a number of different ways. There's a journey that these musicians have gone through, being pretty much superstars on their instrument, and I wonder sometimes how well they've handled that. I think Zakir Hussain handled it very well, and he seemed to be in a good place. I don't know how true that is with El Shankar, but this is really me reaching into my gut reaction. I've always felt there's something there. That's the only way to explain it. There's something there. But the idea that the three of them or four of them could have gone back together is now gone. It's the same as when Rick Laird died with the Mavish Nuksha. Now that is over. It is done. It is in the past. These musicians that we've grown up with are now passing into history, and I don't know. It's probably reflects my age as much as anything else to have been listening to this guy for so long, and to picture him as a relatively young man. You know, when I first heard Zakir Hussain, he would have been in his 30s. And now the guy's died. Now, when I watched the videos and saw the sort of interviews that they did on the recent Shakti tour, he seemed, you know, young looking and healthy. So I don't have any idea what's happened. I don't know what he's died of. Normally I would look at least that up, but I did really want to just do this video off the cuff. How do I pay tribute to this guy? Because I don't feel I really explained it. And part of the reason is because I understand drums and bass and guitar. I understand jazz and stuff like this. Zakir Hussain's virtuosity and other Indian classical musicians seems astonishing, almost miraculous. And you start to think, well, are they all that good, or is Zakir Hussain really that good? And I probably think it's a mixture of the two. You know, the Indian classical music training does create virtuosos. And so Zakir Hussain must have had something really incredible about him to have reached the top of that. And I hazard a guess it is most likely it's the timbre and tone. It always is with a musician. Technical things can be learned, you know, you can practice those. But, you know, if you're a Jacko Pastor or a Miles Davis or a John Coltrane or a Jimi Hendrix, it's the sound and nobody else sounds like you. And I was always very impressed as a young man when I saw the video that I recorded off the TV, off Channel 4 in the 80s, of a concert of Zakir Hussain playing with his father, Alaraka, and doing all the conical stuff and all that type of stuff, of how different their sounds were. And how Alaraka had a very beautiful sound, whereas Zakir had a much more penetrating sound. He had a more rock and roll sound. And I wonder whether that ability to cut, because that's what rock and roll is. You have to be able to cut through. That's the thing you need. Every great rock and roll singer, musician, they cut through. You have to be able to cut. And I think Zakir cut. And I think that's why he was so successful in the studio doing what he did. But the virtuosity of these Indian classical musicians is off the scale. This guy could seem to play anything and in any context. And there's some incredible footage, so much out there. I think there's some footage of John McLaughlin's quartet with Mark Mondesir on drums. And Mark is jamming with Zakir Hussain. It's unbelievable. Both of them are absolutely unbelievable. I'm a drummer. I love rhythm. Zakir is at the top. Zakir is at the top. He's one of the guys. But now he's gone. So I would like to just pay tribute to him and say, Zakir, thank you for all the music. Thank you for all the experiences and wisdom and beauty that you shared out to the world and to me. And I send my condolences or best wishes or whatever to his family and to his friends. And it's always weird doing these videos. I do so many videos on YouTube, but these ones are always, it's always like, there's just, I don't know, it's just, it's like this strange no man's land. The no man's land of the realization that these people are leaving us. Thanks for watching this video, and rest in peace, Zakir Hussain.